Rob Westerholm, thanks for joining.
Yeah, most definitely. Thanks for having me.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about your work as a clinical psychologist?
Yeah, definitely. So, as you mentioned, I'm a clinical psychologist and I specialize in the cognitive behavioral treatment of anxiety and mood related disorders. I've got specialized training working with children and adolescents, but also work with a lot of young adults as well. And, it's primarily looking at sort of the interaction of one's thoughts and physical feelings and behaviors and how those things, reciprocally interact to bring about increases or decreases in things like anxiety or depression or, related emotional challenges. But, of course, you can also look at how it brings about increases or decreases in, more positive things like happiness or excitement or, using it to find more of a sense of purpose within life. So, that's sort of it in a nutshell.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So we've known each other for quite some time now.
Yeah.
We met initially...
10 years maybe?
I'd say 10 years, through Letha, right?
That's right, Letha Wilson, yeah.
And
at Freeze, I think, initially.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Yes, but then there was that party, that after party.
Yes, that's right. That was great.
At Boski, right?
Yeah, it was wild. It was before we lived here in Chelsea, so we were coming from further away as well, and it was like they'd somehow gotten access to a really swanky penthouse apartment that was a recent development in Chelsea by the gallery, and it hadn't sold yet, so somehow they were able to use it to stage this party. And I just remember, it was sort of overwhelmingly just grand and nice, and the rooftop access and the bartenders, and I'm pretty sure there was a bathroom and you could almost look out onto the people literally and figuratively sort of below you if you owned that apartment while using the bathroom.
Right. These are the lords of the world that live in these places. And
yeah.
Somehow we snuck in.
Exactly. Somehow we got you guys can come. Right? Yes, we'll be there.
But so you initially you had a piece of Letha's. And
yes.
You I don't remember the gallery that she was working with at the time, but you connected
yeah.
through collecting her work, and you're also, we should mention very importantly, that you're a collector.
Yeah, that's right. I had gotten a piece by Letha quite a while ago now. I must have been back sometime in 2012 maybe. And it was from a gallery that she was working with in, I think, Italy at the time. And, just through the sort of random interconnectedness of New York, and I'm sure probably Instagram as well, she and I every once in a while would chat, and then I think she and I met a couple times at some of her openings, here in New York, and just kind of, kept in contact, and then we, of course, came across each other at Freeze, and we're hanging out, walking around, looking at artwork, and oh, hey, this is my friend Dan, you should meet him, and there we go.
And the rest is history.
Yeah, that's right.
And I really enjoy our conversations, and often you and I will go and look at artwork in Chelsea and Lower East Side and all around New York, and you're always, I'm always very struck by how connected and aware you are of what's happening in the art world and in painting, and I think you're the kind of collector that I think is really exemplary in that way. That you're well, it's true. You're collecting for all the right reasons.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, it's important. I think that as you know, I kind of came into collecting sort of in a very sort of just slow, sort of organic, natural sort of way. Starting to just appreciate art when I lived in London right after undergrad and before grad school. And just, found myself wandering around and seeing a lot of art that was just literally, either, sculptures in gardens, or this was right when Banksy was just starting out. So there were literally all these big, what I thought of as these graffiti murals, all over the place that were just really cool and unlike anything I'd ever seen in terms of spray paint, quote unquote, graffiti art before. And, all the galleries in London, and all of course, the museums were, free to attend, and so I just wander around and soak up art and see it, and it just kind of started to pique my interest, and I got really excited by it, and I didn't have any prior formal education in art, and I always appreciated art, but never in any sort of sense where I thought, oh, I'd be collecting it one day. And that ignited something, though, just kind of wandering around and just, existing close to it. And doing it on my own terms, I think, was really important, because I think that probably part of what had made me less likely to gravitate towards art in the first place was that the limited exposure I had in, say, I don't know, high school or maybe parts of college seemed kind of almost forced, and, almost being talked down to as to why you should appreciate this great thing, and if you don't appreciate it, well, obviously you're not sophisticated or you're not intelligent or something, and that really went against how I felt in general and really kind of sparked my contrarian tendencies. And I was like, well, screw that then, I don't care about it. But then, being able just to really sort of soak it up on my own and appreciate it for the reasons that I appreciated it, right time, right place. And, I was just starting grad school then, so I couldn't afford any, original art, at least I didn't really think I could. But I found limited edition prints of, artists that I'd seen in London. And so I started getting a few, limited edition prints here and there. And then following the completion of my Ph.D., I got my first job as a clinical psychologist. I was able to, acquire my first work on paper, original artwork. And it was from a gallery in London that I had first seen back in 2002. And that had sort of sparked my interest in art. So it sort of was coming, again, almost this full circle. And it was just the start. And that was back, I think, in 2009.
What was the first piece you collected?
It was this really cool work on, I think they called it antique workbook paper, but it was old school sort of graph paper. And it was by this, sort of contemporary quote unquote street artist named Paul Insect. And what I really loved about it was that it, again, sort of tapped into that sort of initial interest in this sort of art that existed outside of the quote-unquote, sort of white cube. And it really lined up with my interest in alternative music and indie music and things that I had much earlier in my life gravitated towards. And it was an interesting piece in that it, to me, looked like a bird sort of swooping down towards something, but still sort of an abstract sort of perspective. And I like that it was sort of not super photorealistic, but not totally abstract. And you sort of brought some interpretation to it. And, had it and continue to have it. It's actually up in our, current collection still, all these years later. And I remember about 6 years after getting the piece, I'm showing it to a friend, and the friend goes, "Oh, that's really cool. There's that woman's face in it." And I paused and did a double take, and I said, "Wait, what?" And I hear my wife in the room go, "Wait, you didn't see that all this time?" And I said, "No, I always just saw the bird." She goes, "Wait, the bird?" I said, "What are we talking about here?" And we both went back and looked at it, and you could see that sure enough, it was both a bird, but also sort of an obscured woman's face. And that just seemed so perfect for my first piece of art that, drew my interest in that we collected, because it really was highlighting how the viewer's perspective and their expectation really informs the meaning and the sort of appreciation of the artwork in the piece, and how, a lot of times art is both sort of a way to communicate feelings and ideas, but is also almost a bit of a projective from the viewer as well as the artist themselves. And I love how each piece resonates differently with each person, and that, I think, connects in a lot of ways with my interest in psychology, about how we have all these individual differences in ways in which we perceive the world around us, and so much about how I react to the world, you react to the world, how we emotionally respond to it, is in some ways less about what is in front of us and more about how we perceive what's in front of us. And I think that's just so fascinating. That's why I think both psychology and the work that I do, and art especially, are just, for me, endlessly interesting and always a source of, sort of inspiration and curiosity.
Absolutely. I'm glad you say that. It really does. I think every artwork is different depending on who's looking at it. And so it's really activated by consciousness. And I did want to ask you about the relationship of your work as a clinical psychologist and your sort of, I would say almost I want to almost call it work as a collector, because I see you as a collector like it's like a creative endeavor for you, right?
For sure. I mean, it's, it's you go, but way back, I'm somebody who goes all in when I'm interested in something. There's not a whole lot of in between, and so with artwork, and collecting art, I love learning about it. I love looking at it. I love soaking it up. Very much in the way that I just sort of naturally sort of dipped my toe into soaking it up when I was in London all those years ago, and so. For me, oftentimes what'll happen is I'll come, home if I'm in the office, or I'll, finish work if I'm seeing patients remotely, and I'll feel, I'm very almost sort of verbally exhausted in a way, because it's all talking and listening. And I discovered that I'll often then go and just look, whether it's on Instagram, whether it's on my computer, if it's on the weekend, going to galleries, and just almost soak up things visually, and it feels almost like a nice sort of reset or counterbalance to all of the verbally mediated work that I'm doing. And I like to read about it as well, but looking is first and foremost. And oftentimes I'll see like a painting or just another artwork or an artist that really just piques my interest. Then I'll do more of a deep dive into like, where are they from? What do they do? What informs their practice? Things like that too. But that never really happens, unless, of course, it strikes me, of course, on a visual level, because that's certainly for me the way that I first approach an artwork, first perceive an artwork, and I think probably for most people. But I remember a long time ago somebody telling me that it's important to, let's say, like look with your eyes, or buy with your eyes, not with your ears. As in, like, and don't think things are important just because other people tell you that they're important. Really make sure that it strikes you, personally. So I just think through that intense interest, it probably seems, especially to people who are in the field of, say, like, I don't know, art advising or curation, it seems like it is work, of course, but like for me, it's a passion. It's something that when I finish my actual work, which is a different type of passion, I then go and just deep dive into looking and learning and reading and seeing and visiting artworks. And I just think it's something that for me, it both sort of recharges me, it rebalances me, and it inspires me, which I think is really, really great. So I love it.
So there's an initial spark, you would say, an initial connection, that there's something there. I wonder what that is. Do you know, have you tried to sort of unpack that or pull that apart, what that initial sort of interest is?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that, and it changes over time too. I think there's definitely, I guess, another sort of, for me, parallel or similarity between psychology and, art, I guess, appreciation or, collecting, is that there's no real substitute for experience and time. And my eye has definitely become more and more informed over time just through the act of looking and spending time with artwork. And I remember an early mentor and supervisor in psychology said the same sort of thing for psychology. So there's no substitute for experience, for sitting in the room with many, many, many people over many, many years, and the feel and the knowledge and the exchange, both verbally and non-verbally, in terms of informing your skill as a psychologist. And that's definitely been true. And I think it's definitely been true for art as well. And I can remember early on, seeing artwork, and well, first I had no idea if it was something that someone else was like already doing in a way. Like, obviously nothing exists in isolation, and everything is influenced in some way by other things. But sometimes you'll see an artwork and you're like, oh, that looks very much like so-and-so's artwork. And it almost feels kind of like, oh, is it, sort of, copying them, or is it its own thing in and of itself? Is it derivative? Is it unique? Is it something new? And I remember when it first started off, like, I just had no sort of baseline. So I'd see something and like, oh, that's interesting. And then I'd continue to look before I, would pull the trigger and buy something, of course. And sometimes I find like, oh wait, that's very similar to this other thing, and that's very similar to these 2 or 3 other things. And that might inform me in terms of, oh, I like this style of artwork, right? But, over time, and just I think being more in the sort of quote unquote art world, I guess, I've got a, certainly a better sense now of like certain styles that might be unique or new or just seem like a departure from what's going on. And I think that's oftentimes what really strikes me when I see something that just surprises me. When I see something that I'm like, whoa, like, how did they do that? Or, kind of scratch my head for a minute and have to think, what am I looking at here? Like,
you're looking for an experience that you haven't had before.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways. I used to describe it as I need to see something and it almost be like a punch to the stomach, it would like knock the wind out of me. But I was realizing further though it had to be almost like a sustained punch to the stomach, because there's a lot of things you see and you're like, oh, cool.
Well, it reminds me of the Ed Ruscha quote that good art should elicit a huh, wow versus wow, huh.
I like that. Exactly.
But I want to just go back a little bit to you saying that you would look at something and it was kind of, I got a sense that sort of you can't really articulate what it is, right? Like it's nonverbal.
Not at first, at least. Not at first, at least. But maybe it's something that's happening sort of below the conscious mind or simultaneously conscious and subconscious. I think so. I mean, I think it's funny because in some ways it has to at least have something that, like a hook, if you will, like it catches your eye, but it can't be too apparent or readily digestible either, because I think it loses its interest if it is so obvious right away. It's like the difference between like a pop song that you're kind of like, oh yeah, that's catchy, and then you're like, oh my god, I've heard it 5 times and I'm fed up with it. Forget this is garbage. It's like sugary sweet,
junk food, yeah.
Overly saccharine, right?
Yeah.
Versus something more like, I often think back to the first time I ever heard Paranoid Android by Radiohead off of OK Computer, and I just was like, there was something melodic and strange, almost off-putting in a way too, and dissonant, but in a way that kept me coming back and being like, there's something here, this is cool, I can't put my finger on it like you said, but like, and it reveals itself, that song for me at least at the time, revealed itself slowly over time, and with each listen I'd come back and like hear something different, and that's what I love about the work that I collect. It reveals itself slowly, but again, there has to be something there that at least catches my interest. There has to be like a small spark or like a hook or something. I'm like, oh, that's aesthetically appealing in a way, but at the same time, not just so obviously that it just can be taken in one sitting. And almost all the work in our collection, I find like I'll be walking around our apartment or just my wife and I'll be looking at a piece and we'll notice something different, like, wait, oh my god, did you see that? Like it might just be a simple line of color that I hadn't seen before because it was a little bit different than the rest of the piece, and most of the piece is like these shades of blues and purples, but then there's like sort of a warmer magenta. I'm like, oh, that's a beautiful, just like literally like brushstroke. Or it could be something as central as like, oh my god, that's a lady's face and I didn't even see it, I just saw the bird, as well. But it always seems to be giving something more, and the more you take the time to spend the time with it, and I think that's again sort of that nice sort of reciprocal, almost gift. It's like it rewards you if you spend the time with it and take the time with it.
And so it changes, but you're changing at the same time. You see it differently, and you're kind of a different person in the future, right? So it's
exactly.
kind of, you're both evolving together.
For sure, which I think is a really cool thing, because I can't think of many other things that one could collect, right? Or like quote unquote like acquire, that changes in that same way. It's like as a kid growing up, I always think I like to kind of collect things. Like I had, a sneaker collection when I was a kid, or comic books, or, music for sure. Music maybe is actually something that evolves with you, which I think is really great. But in terms of an actual object or an item that you're just like looking at, not necessarily like listening to, like with music as, it exists, sort of, in sound waves. I can't think of anything else that really changes so much with you. And I think that's such a special thing about art.
And it's something that is kind of dependent upon the viewer, right? Like if you have a painting sitting there, I think Agnes Martin has a quote that she says that the art isn't happening the painting isn't the art; it's the experience. You know, it's what's happening between the viewer and the painting is the art.
For sure, I could see that definitely. I don't want to take away the emphasis on the art because I love the art, but I definitely agree. I think the viewer is certainly an essential part of that equation.
Yeah. But it's really so. That's what. How do you view like process and product?
It's a good question. I think you mean in terms of viewing or in terms of what
so
exactly?
You have an object.
Right.
You're collecting an object, but it's also an experience. So it's also I guess a record of a process of. And I guess one thing I've noticed, you really have a way of getting into the psychology of the maker. Like I've sort of watched as we go to galleries. I'm just quite fascinated by your ability to really get into the mindset of the person making this piece. And you don't paint, which is interesting for me as a painter. I feel like less connected often to the stuff that we look at because you're able to sort of like really go into the sort of try, or you're like really attempting to break down the what's happening on a mental level.
That's interesting you say that. It makes sense, and it's funny because I think one of the things I really enjoy about our gallery visits together is, you're right, I think that is sort of sometimes how I approach it, and then you as a painter, who has training and education and all of this experience doing it, I love how you're able to then talk about like the actual creation of the work itself. So we kind of put that together, and I think it's always such a fun experience and such a nice dialogue.
We should make a painting sometime.
Right, that'd be cool.
Let's collaborate.
That'd be cool.
Yeah.
I like that.
I
I
wonder
like
what that
that.
would look like. Yeah, but there's so much depth to it. To a single painting, you could we could talk about one painting for hours and hours, really.
So true. No, it's so true, and I think interestingly, and I guess this makes sense given my interest in people and psychology and how people create and make meaning and experience meaning. But so much of art has, in a way, maybe it shouldn't be surprising, but surprisingly has become such a social experience for me. And, part of that, for example, is, like you said, I really love to get into the mindset and the purpose or goal of the artist, sort of like, what were they trying to communicate? Where are they coming from? What was going on in their life? What has informed this viewpoint? And I think, importantly, pretty much every work in our collection, I've either met the artist or corresponded with them via email or Instagram. And many of them have had over to our apartment to see the work. But for me, it's important not just to like have this isolated object, but to, understand and connect more to the person who created it, that human experience, because it's really enriches it. And I remember being so surprised where numerous artists will tell me I'll write the artist like, hey, dear so-and-so, I just wanted to reach out to you and say like, hey, we acquired this piece, we love it so much for these reasons, and this is sort of what I take from it, and I would love to hear if you have anything you'd love to share, blah blah blah. And so many times an artist writes back, or I'll talk to them at their studio and they're like, wow, that's really cool. Like, a lot of collectors don't ever reach out. A lot of collectors never actually ask about the work. And to me, that was always such a like, what? Well, why not? Like, why wouldn't you? Especially if you have access to the person who made this thing that you hopefully love, right? Why wouldn't you engage in that opportunity to talk to them? For me, it so enriches the piece, the experience, the memory. Pretty much every piece in our collection, when I look through it, I could like tell a story about it, like how we got it, what the artist said about it, what was going on at the time, how that connected to other work in our collection, and I love that. I love that because it makes that, at least for me, so much deeper and richer and more valuable. And again, I can't see why anyone wouldn't want to do that with things that again, they're collecting because they hopefully love them.
Well, that's why I was saying I really appreciate your sort of the way you collect work for all the right reasons, clearly. But I'm interested in what you just said. That makes me think that you're really considering the context, not just the object, not just the artist, but really the context, because it's not just the thing. You're in this whole context. Who made the piece? Who are they? What are the traditions they're working in? A lot of the stuff you can, of course, you can infer most of this from looking at a piece.
Sure.
But who are they? Like, why do they make this thing? What are they like? What is the texture of the experience? And really, and if it's something you could articulate, you wouldn't need to look at the piece, right?
Right. No, it's so true. It's so true.
It's a whole different, it's like a communication on a meta level or something like that.
I think so. No, I think so. And again, it just sort of taps back into that whole idea of how I'm so fascinated with how we make meaning, you know, not even necessarily make it, but how we perceive it, you know. I remember reading in a psychology textbook a long time ago, probably like in college, how it said that human beings are meaning-making machines, some version of that, and how it's just natural for us to look at something and try to like understand it, try to like derive some sort of meaning, or like, how does this make sense, or put it together in a way that somehow, whether it's some sort of causal relationship or just a way to process it in a way that sort of fits, in a lot of ways, a predetermined sort of schema or you know, mindset or viewpoint. And I just think, again, that's what's so fascinating, this idea that we all see things differently, we all make meaning differently, and yet we all coexist in a similar enough reality that we can, you know, talk and, you know, hopefully get along and, you know, interact together.
It's an amazing achievement, really.
It is.
And being here in New York City, it's an amazing feat of collaboration. You know, all these people together, living together in one place like this. You know,
Yeah.
I would say after I moved to New York about 10 years ago, my tolerance for weirdness has increased a lot in a healthy way. You know, like so. you accept a lot of weird, like, and I'm a weirdo too, but
hey, same, proudly.
Yeah, exactly. And but seeing all the, you know, really the cult, and that's being an artist here, and for you, I'm sure the same way of being a collector here, and like you really have access to just incredible the energy of it, right? It's like not just, there's something that's sort of what's the word? You can't measure it, right? There's an energy.
Exactly, like not immeasurable, unquantifiable, something.
Unquantifiable, yeah.
No, for sure. I think that's so true. When So I initially came out to New York at the end of my final year of my Ph.D. for clinical psychology, because you have to do something called a predoctoral residency, or actually a predoctoral internship, actually, but it's like a doctor's residency where you get matched somewhere to do this intensive year of clinical applied training. And I was fortunate enough to match at the Columbia Medical Center, and so that's where I finished, you know, my final year. But during the process of applying for this predoctoral internship, you have to interview at a bunch of different places, and you really hope you get matched somewhere. And I remember the first time coming out to New York, I remember it was definitely overwhelming on one hand, and I'd been here once before to visit a friend, but you know, this was just me coming on my own to interview for something, but just awe-inspiring. And then the second time I came back, maybe a month later for another interview at a different institution, it was familiar enough that it was less overwhelming, but I just felt this like electricity like coursing through my veins. I remember I stepped out of my hotel, I had a general sense of, you know, where the subway was and where I was going to go, and I just remember feeling like possibility and excitement. And I remember thinking like, this is where I need to be.
That's it. It's about possibility. And I think the best artwork, the best work for me is about possibility. You see, and that's the best possible sort of thing in life, is to have. Well, I think I feel so lucky to have all these possibilities.
Yeah.
But this is a city of possibility.
It is.
Potential, right?
It is. There's so much potential. I think, and it's funny too that you say that, because I think, of course, the risk of endless potential is lack of results or accomplishment, right? In a way too. in some ways I think it's easy to sort of almost wax philosophic about like possibility and potential without actually committing and making it happen. And I think that's sort of a fine balance and a fine sort of line to walk. I think in, you know, art certainly, but it's just in our lives as well too, right? Like trying to grow up, right? Trying to think of what do you want to be, you know, when you grow up, and how, you know, when you're a kid, part of I think what's so exciting is all this possibility. You know, there's a lot of hard things about being a kid, of course, too, that, you know, life's very much out of your control in a lot of ways, but there's possibility. There's so many doors that are potentially open, but at a certain point, right, in order to actually accomplish something, it requires
a kind of shrinking.
Yeah, exactly, like a pruning, right? Like your brain goes through this neurological pruning as you get older to become more efficient and successful. And the same thing is true for possibility. You have to close a bunch of doors.
That's right.
In order to go through one.
That's a good point.
Which I think is so important. And so New York is this really exciting, sort of strange place where there's so much possibility. And more than any other place I've lived, I've met a lot of people, and then they've left as well too. Yeah. And, you know, hopefully I don't take that too personally, but you know, it's just like people come and they're like, wow, there's all this possibility, and then either they decide that it's just not for them, or sometimes it's too difficult, or it's too expensive, or it's just not what they thought they wanted, and they leave for somewhere more specific, perhaps, to do something that, you know, they can do elsewhere for whatever the reason is.
Did you see that show Pretend It's a City with Scorsese, like miniseries with, I think it was, is her name Fran Lebowitz?
Oh yeah, that is. I haven't seen it though. No,
it's so good. She says that nobody can afford to live in New York.
It's crazy,
but we do anyway. You know,
we do. You have to want it though.
Yeah,
you really got to want to be here. This isn't a place you just kind of casual, like, oh yeah, we'll see. I'm just here. Yeah. It's like, no, you got to want to be here, because if you don't want to be here, why would you be here?
It'd be crazy.
Exactly. It's expensive. It's noisy. It can often be dirty. It can be chaotic. All these different things, but for all of the good things, it's, you know, it's such a creative hotbed. There's anything and everything you could want at just about any time you might want it. You know, there's art, there's culture, there's, you know, I mean, art is culture, of course, but there's theater, there's music, there's fashion, there's a very psychology-friendly city, which I certainly appreciate. There's so much amazing food. There's just so many different people from different backgrounds that are coming together in ways that you will not find, as far as I can tell, anywhere else. And so for psychology, it's great. My wife is a fashion designer, and it's a great place for fashion, of course, too, which is incredible. We're both originally from Chicago, and, you know, this just fits us so much better. She, you know, if I can plug her for a second, she's incredible. Yeah. My wife, Monica Wesley, has this amazingly unique and beautiful line of lingerie called Userana, and she, you know, has a background in art and then specifically in fashion. And this was just, you know, the place to make that happen, because, you know, she was at school at the Art Institute, and then she came and finished out her, you know, academic career, you know, sort of similar to me out here in New York, but at Parsons for fashion. And then she really just figured out this way to combine her artistic creativity with her, you know, highly skilled fashion ability and like training, and, you know, created this unbelievably beautiful line of, you know, lingerie that embraces all the things that she embraces, such as inclusivity and being seen for who you are, and you know, just this, again, beautiful mix of form and function. And again, for anyone who's interested, Userana, check it out.
Hi, Monica. Yeah. Well, speaking, I don't think I ever, did you guys meet here in New York or Chicago?
We met in Chicago. We met in Chicago very randomly, but if fate is a thing, which our meeting actually made me think fate might be more of a thing than anything else in my life, actually. We met at an all-night masquerade dance party in Chicago.
That's like, that doesn't surprise me one bit.
It feels almost like, I don't know,
knowing both of you guys, yeah.
Right, like I vaguely recall like watching that that remake of Romeo and Juliet, you know. I
was picturing Eyes Wide Shut, actually.
Oh, yeah. little
it's a little weird.
A little less creepy,
maybe,
but
yeah.
I mean, that still works.
Yeah,
but it still works.
It's Kubrick, though. So.
Exactly. Exactly. That was Kubrick, because I'm thinking more Baz Luhrmann, right?
Yeah.
But we're like, you know, they meet at, I think it was some sort of masquerade.
That's right.
But that was exactly what it was, and but it was a buddy of mine who's a professional musician in Chicago. I remember like texting me his pre-smartphone, and he's like, "What are you doing? You got to get to this great, crazy, cool like warehouse sort of dance party. You go up this like dark flight of stairs and it's off of an alleyway, but trust me, it's okay, it's cool, you'll appreciate it." And I was like, that sounds just my speed. And so I remember I went there, and sure enough, climbed these multiple flights of stairs, got to this like warehouse loft that was just these like 20-30 foot high ceilings, all painted black with interesting funky art on the walls, and these two makeshift DJ booths where the DJs were dressed as bumblebees, like the Blind Melon No Rain video. And I was like, this is cool.
This must be the place, right?
This must be the place. But at this point, again, like no one had masks on or anything, and I wasn't told it was a masquerade party, so I didn't know, and very few other people seemed to. But then I see this person, this beautiful woman who has this sort of half mask, which I later found she had like applied to her face with Elmer's glue, and fake eyelashes, and just drop dead gorgeous. And somehow I seemed to float to her, she floated to me, and we ended up dancing until the wee hours of the morning, and that was that. But we found out that we had been within probably 10 to 15 feet of each other numerous times in the past at small, tiny, like little concerts in Chicago, but just had never actually crossed paths until then. And the timing wasn't right for various reasons, and somehow the timing was then, and I ended up getting into Columbia Medical Center. She ended up getting into Parsons, and that was somehow, I want to say, 17 years ago.
Amazing. Yeah. Your wedding was what? That was...
Wedding was about 7 years ago.
7 years ago, yeah. That was the swankiest wedding there. The best wedding that I've been to. The Art Institute. It was beautiful. You guys rented out that place in the Art Institute of Chicago. And so both of you grew up in Chicago, right?
Yeah, she grew up in Chicago proper in like the sort of Wrigleyville, Lakeview area.
Mm-hmm.
And then I had grown up in the western suburbs about 45 minutes outside of Chicago.
So speaking of, we should talk a little about your early life and how your early interest in, when did you know you would get into clinical psychology? How was that, like, did you have a background, or was there something that made you interested in that field?
No, that's a good question. I think there were 3 sort of career goal phases in my life. And I remember, for whatever reason, from about kindergarten to 6th grade, I thought I was going to become a veterinarian because I loved animals. And in grade school, I realized I liked science. So I thought I'm going to be a veterinarian, and I'll live on a farm, which doesn't quite fit with Manhattan. But then, for whatever reason, I think because I was also a competitive swimmer, and I was doing a lot of swimming, I remember from like around 7th grade to maybe junior in high school, I thought I wanted to be a marine biologist. So again, it was continuing that sort of thread of interest in animals and science, but now rather than on a farm, I'm in the ocean. And then I remember it was my senior year of high school. I had the opportunity to take Psych AP, which was only offered for seniors, who were potentially interested in it. And I just remember being so fascinated both by what it was teaching me, but also with how much it just sort of fit how I already saw the world, how I was ready. I remember being so interested before taking that course already in how something could affect a friend of mine and myself so differently despite it being like the same thing. And a lot of that, I think, was drawn from my interest in the time. I was super interested in music from maybe like freshman year of high school onward, primarily because of how it communicated emotion and how it was a way to almost turn, being sort of like a hopeless romantic, sort of moody adolescent, right, angsty, how it could turn sort of tragedy into art, as it were, and how you could use these like oftentimes sad experiences to create meaning and create art from it. So like bands like Smashing Pumpkins or like Nirvana, growing up in the, sort of the height of like the sort of alternative and sort of grunge scene, and most of these songs were kind of sad or depressing or angsty, but I thought were so inspiring and like beautiful, and they really just filled me with intense like adrenaline or emotion, or it was a way to sort of turn sadness into action in a way. But so I was really interested in that, but how different people process things differently. Some would get sad, some would be inspired, some might be sad, but then be inspired to create something from it that then inspires others. And then all of a sudden I'm taking this, the psych course and finding that, wow, there's like this whole field of study that kind of focuses on that. And on one hand, that was super exciting. On the other hand, I was kind of bummed out because I thought that I was possibly onto something unique and special here, and then found, this is sort of something that's been around for a long time, and especially like, cognitive behavioral therapy, which I ended up gravitating towards. This idea of the way that you really see things really affects how you feel about them and how you respond to them. It's already a thing, but at least that sort of, made me much more, I think, aligned with being able to learn more and sort of throw myself into that field. And that was really the start of it right there, just sort of realizing that this is an area of study, this is something that one can pursue. I wasn't quite sure I wanted to do psychology just yet. I really I was fascinated with the brain and how that enables us to perceive things, so I was interested in potentially, neuroscience, neurosurgery, possibly psychiatry as well too. So I ended up actually finding, thankfully, a small liberal arts school that was a great fit for me because they actually had an interdisciplinary neuroscience program. And so I was able to, I ended up deciding I was going to major in neuroscience, and about halfway through the program, you had to commit to either an emphasis in psychology or biology. And so I had a good, 2 years under my belt of taking all these classes and just kind of seeing, not just on paper, but what do I actually gravitate towards. And although I also really liked the bio courses, I found myself really just loving the psychology courses. So I ended up doing interdisciplinary neuroscience and psychology in undergrad, and towards the end of my undergrad career, realizing that psychology more than psychiatry was calling to me, just because psychology was going to be the thing where I could actually talk to people and get a sense of how they saw the world and really understand how their perspective informed their lives, and then how my understanding of that perspective would hopefully enable to me to come up with a way to pitch helpful coping strategies that they might not have thought of on their own, or they might not have wanted to do. But if I could pitch it in a way that actually resonated with their sort of sensibilities and how they saw the world, they might be more likely to try it and hopefully find some value in it.
That's great. Yeah, I think I should also mention what you're doing as a clinical psychologist. There needs to be more of that in the world, where we're living in a society which is, I think, in many ways unwell, and I think the big part of it is it's the mind, right?
Yeah.
It's consciousness. It's like that's where it originates.
For sure. No, I mean, I think probably everyone says it at every point in history, but I definitely feel like we're in very tumultuous times right now.
It has been. That's right. And I think there's a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety and depression sort of in the culture, in the world, and I think anything you can do to lessen that, even by a little bit, even one person, that's worthwhile.
No, for sure.
That was sort of the idea behind this podcast, I guess, in some way. Like, if I can, not that I'm gonna save somebody's life or anything necessarily, but there's an element of, if you can just make one person a little kinder or something, or not that it has to be so objective oriented, in the same way that art, you couldn't say necessarily, okay, this piece is doing this is its function, it does this,
totally.
But there's a real effect. And I wonder if you could talk about how you feel, you're saying when you come home from work, you're looking at a painting and it makes you feel maybe more relaxed, or more like you're engaging in a way that's helpful to you personally. Yeah,
no, I don't know exactly if this is what's happening, but I mean, from a almost sort of neuroscience background, it would make sense that it would. I almost feel like sometimes after doing so much listening and talking and formulating in a verbally mediated way, I almost feel like that area of my brain is tapped out, it's been overstimulated, overused, it's done, and I need to almost go and just look. And certainly when I look and I think about a work, those thoughts are going to involve words, certainly, but just looking, I almost feel like I'm getting this very helpful sort of rebalancing, or maybe the occipital lobe is starting to actually become engaged more than say like the parietal lobe and like the areas of like Broca's and Wernicke's area, which have a much more to do with like understanding language and creating language. And I don't know, it really just sort of balances me out, just because I'll come home and I'm just like, man, like I'm verbally spent. Even just like reading sometimes will feel kind of like it's still tapping into that same muscle that's already been like sort of worked to the point where it's tired. And then coming home and just like looking at something and just being able to sit with it and just like mentally, words of course will sort of come up in my mind, but no words are required. I'll just sit and stare and just let it sort of soak in, and just it's sort of a way to be mindful, because I'm just really focused on the present moment in a specific way, and I'm in some ways sort of just describing it to myself, just looking at the colors, looking at the lines, looking at the composition. And I guess when we think of mindfulness, we think of it as being present in a non-judgmental way. And I'm certainly not being non-judgmental when I'm looking at his works, because normally I'm like thinking about the things that I like about them. But I'm happy that at least I'm not being judgmental in sort of a negative way, because that's not a very pleasant experience, I think, for anyone. But it really does, I think, just sort of help me to sort of be present, and in some ways, as much as one can, get out of one's head and just be focused on something. It's sort of almost like an unintentional meditative exercise.
So you're kind of dealing with language, or you're speaking all day, you're talking, you're in the world of words all day, and you come home and you can kind of turn off the language part of the brain.
Yeah, in some ways I think so. It's at least a nice sort of counterbalance to that.
Absolutely, yeah. Whenever I see something that's profound, or to me personally, when I enjoy a piece of art, you can't really, you can say what it is, you can talk about it, but you can't really articulate the experience of it. Are there any good shows right now you've seen recently?
I'm trying to think if there's anything. We haven't seen a ton of shows lately. We were I was mentioning to you before we started the podcast, we were traveling, my wife and I were traveling with her mother to Rome, so we're out of town, which was an incredible experience, but it was far different than most of my art experiences I seek out, because we're looking at stuff from 500 BC up, through maybe the 17th century. That's sort of the spot. A lot of this, art in Rome, and I think the most contemporary art piece that I saw that I took a picture of was from maybe 1950 something, whereas most of the art I look at now is all very contemporary, made by living artists, who should be at the gallery during the opening when the show is happening. But so I went for a walk with my dog Darcy yesterday, and I saw a good show at Albert's Benda. Leo Frontini, he was doing a really cool set of beautiful figurative works, I think mostly oil on canvas and some oil on board, and just a really sort of unique figurative perspective, sort of elongated arms and legs and full of movement, which I thought was really, really cool. There's also a show that I want to see maybe later today even over at Fredericks and Fraser that has a number of also interesting sort of most often portraits, but I think also some sort of more abstract works as well too. But there's always something, which is nice, which is such a beautiful thing about living in this city. Yeah,
you're lucky. We're blocks away from all these shows in Chelsea.
Yeah.
I just came from the Laura Owen show.
Oh, nice.
At Matthew Mark's.
How was that?
Outstanding.
Amazing. Okay.
Amazing.
Check that
So
as well.
good. So good. Really, truly, very, very much an experience. The paintings. My friend that I went with mentioned that he thought that each painting in the main space was like a song in an album. Like they were all different, but they all fit in the same kind of context. Anyway, I'd recommend that. It's really, It's really good.
I'll definitely check that out. Yeah, she's incredible.
She's so good. And that's the thing. It's like you're here. It's like really such a privilege to be able to see these things, and it's all free.
It really is. It's incredible. No, that's been something that's been funny too, is that with Instagram, you know, you connect with so many people in so many different ways, and you know, every once in a while, unless I forget, like, just how fortunate it is to be able to see all this work, every once in a while somebody will like comment on a post of an artwork that I posted that I've seen, and I'm like, oh my god, that's so cool that you've seen that, or like, oh, I really wanted to, someday I hope to see this person's work, you know, in person. And it is just such a great reminder. I'm like, oh yeah, I literally just saw like an opening for this artist, and and I met the artist, and we saw like 15 pieces by that artist, and this person, you know, from somewhere, you know, that's not here is saying like, wow, that's so cool. Like, I've been following that person, you know, their career for a long time. I've never gotten to see their work actually in person. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's such a good thing to remember.
Yeah, and seeing it in person is so important because not only, I mean, you get the actual feel, the texture, the energy. Very much what we're sort of dealing with here is they're like vessels that contain a certain kind of energy.
Yeah.
And you can actually understand what's happening there. I recall the time we were at Pace dorking out on that, those little paintings. Who was that?
Is it Rakib Shah?
Rakib Shah.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. And you can really, like, looking at the texture of those, they're beautiful. Like, you can really see his hand in it. But you really had to be there to get up close and sort of like enter those worlds.
It's so detailed, and for Rakib especially, he paints and uses porcupine quills to get the like tiniest little line work, and to use the porcupine quill with like some of the enamel that he uses. So it's like, I remember, especially for someone like, for him, it was so great to see that in person, and to like see the way like the light catches it, or like the way that certain like shadows play, because there's also like
there's
depth,
like embossed kind of, there's a texture. You have one of his pieces, right?
We do. We're like super lucky. It was just, it's one of my favorite works of his too. I mean, obviously I'm sure I'm biased because it's our piece, but it's this incredible piece called The Whistleblower, which I thought was just, again, a very sort of, you know, of the time. It felt so relevant, you know, again, just sort of like speaking out, calling attention to some sort of like, you know, wrongdoing, or sounding the alarm when necessary. And it's this sort of hybrid creature that's part human, part peacock. And it's so beautiful. It's a small work on paper, you know, probably no more than like 8 by 10 inches, but it is just such a gem, and so detailed. And again, the enamel and the watercolor and the detail of these like little fine jewels that he has, like the sort of like armbands that are encrusting sort of the gold of what this creature is wearing. And it catches my eye all the time. It's such a small piece, and yet I found like an outsized proportion of my gaze is sort of directed at it relative to the size, just because it is just so stunning and beautiful. And you can tell it was far from a quick piece. You know, it's one of those works that it clearly took time, but we were lucky enough to get it from some benefit auction from this institution in London years ago. And like, yeah, again, as with quite a few works actually in our collection, something I probably couldn't either get access to or couldn't afford now even.
That Lowy Hollow, right? That
crazy.
I keep telling you, sell it and put all that money put it in Bitcoin.
Never,
you'll be a billionaire.
Never. It's periodically as it rises and falls.
That's the thing, is that you actually just, you love the piece.
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
Going back to your sort of like the right reasons for collecting. You're not investing. You know, you're not trying to like. It's not stocks. You know.
No, it's. I mean, it's obviously it's cool, and it somehow feels like either like validating or like exciting when you see a piece that you loved, you know, somehow like is going up in value or being seen as more and more important somehow, like in the, you know, sort of, you know, our history canon or whatever the case may be. And, you know, we love, you know, as much as I miss the piece, we haven't had the Lowy piece, for example, for over a year at this point, because we've lent it to a couple of different institutions for, you know, retrospectives of her work. We were actually supposed to be getting it back soon, but we had lent it, you know, to, what was the place?
The Eldridge.
The Eldridge, exactly, by your sisters.
Mm-hmm.
And then we lent it as well to Virginia Commonwealth, to their museum, because that was actually where Lowy got one of her degrees, I think, her MFA.
She got her MFA there, yeah.
And so it's been gone for over a year, so like we miss it, but like we're happy to have it out in the world. People can see it again, maybe for people who hadn't seen it in person.
That's right, and you're very generous. You'll share, just in terms of, you also on a social media platform. You're sharing your work and your interests and your life,
Sure.
and with me as well. Like there are conversations. There's a generosity of spirit, like we're talking today. But it's really, I think it's important. Like art is something that is not, it has to be. It's like a communal effort, really.
Yeah, no, I think so. And it's nice when, we're able to take something that, spoke to us, and then either whether it's having people over, or whether it's, posting an image, or whether it's, loaning the piece, to some sort of, institution or show, it's nice to be able to share that, with a broader audience. And I get really excited too, just even like, silly things, like even just like posting a piece of artwork, again, whether it's something that we've acquired or just something that like I appreciate out in the world. It's exciting just to see what other people have to like say about it. I love having conversations with other people on Instagram, whether it's other artists or curators or gallerists or just fellow art appreciators and enthusiasts, and just engaging in that dialogue again, because we all see it differently, and we all, whether it's because of the context or because of our unique perspective, bring something different to that piece. And it's so much fun to be able to have these conversations with people who may be literally halfway around the world on something like, Instagram, just because of a post, that I decided to put up. And it's also just, it's become such a social thing. I've ended up talking with people, again, like around the world. I've had a gallerist that came over from this really great gallery she owns in Seoul, Korea, called Everyday Noonday. And she came over and saw our collection, and because we struck up a conversation on Instagram, and we acquired a piece from her gallery of an artist duo that's based in California, but again going from California to Seoul back to New York. We recently, a show that I'm really excited to see actually. There's a show up at the Hole right now in Tribeca of this really cool Korean painter named Young-guk Yi, and he is this really cool painter who does this interesting mix of like, it's almost like op art meets digital meets figurative, but it's all painted, by hand and by airbrush, of these very strange, almost sci-fi sort of portraits of dogs and people and other things, where it's like it's got these sort of multiple perspectives of one creature all at once. So you'll see maybe like a dog where it's like evolving into a dog with like 5 versions of its head and like 3 eyes, and they're like a person with multiple iterations of a person moving, of noses and mouth, and it's simultaneously incredibly appealing but almost slightly grotesque and off-putting, which is kind of cool, again, because you kind of got to almost get used to it over time.
That's very you too,
right?
You say that, because sometimes we'll go to shows and that's exactly this, like this stuff that I've seen you be interested in, and I'm kind of like, I'm not totally into that, but that's cool. You are, so it's nice to have, like, it's nice to see, like, just back to what you were saying, like everybody's going to view a piece differently, because everybody has their different, and there's no wrong way to look at something. There's no wrong thing to like. There's no even, I mean, now I think if you're in New York and you have a kind of a certain way of looking, because we live in a certain culture and there's a certain context, and perhaps the things I like now would have seemed pompous to my former self, or to people that are in a different, but there's the beautiful thing about it is there's no objective good, like the best art, or
right. It's like there's critique, right? Mm-hmm. There's critique, and there's obviously a lot of very well respected and well informed art critics and art historians and people who write about it, and can bring very valid things to that, certainly. But it's true, you like what you like, and that's the point, right? Because that's the joy it brings. I don't know anybody. I'm sure there are people who maybe just, if it is just for like an investment, I don't know anybody who's buying work they dislike.
Yeah, I think
that seems like a bummer.
That would be yeah. I mean, you could. There's a lot of smarter investments, I think, than that.
Yeah, I would hope so.
Just in the same way, being an artist is like not the greatest career choice. It's like there's a lot of easier things you could be doing.
Sure.
You have to really, really want to be doing it.
Totally.
And as a collector too, you also have to really, really want to do it and be really interested. Yeah,
for sure. No, for sure. No, it's so true. And I think that's kind of the beauty of it too, though. And it's like, I'm gonna butcher this quote because I just only vaguely remember it, but I think it was like Oscar Wilde said something like art should like have something that has no purpose whatsoever, or some version of that. Like it's just something, no functional purpose or no practical purpose, and that's often the case. But it's something that I think touches on and sort of connects to this part of humanity that's so special, that creative element, that generative ability, that thing inside of us, or inside at least some of us, that allows one to bring something inspirational or beautiful into this world that, somehow allows us to be more than just sort of utilitarian sort of creatures that are just like, going about our lives for concrete reasons, just basic survival. It's, art is, I think, definitely something that goes far beyond just basic survival, but I think then can inspire, survival, and can inspire us to get through tumultuous, difficult times too, which is such a wonderful thing.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah, and then so that you could almost say that its function is to not have a function, a clear function, but it does. There's a real effect. It's important for a lot of reasons. For one thing, that I think it keeps the culture from stagnating.
Yeah, for sure.
In the same way that, not in the same way, I should say that, like in 1984, for example, like there's no art, in these books or these like dystopian dramas.
Yeah.
There's not, you don't have this kind of freedom and creativity, and
totally.
Also, maybe it goes back to possibility, right?
Yeah, for sure.
It's about the expression of some kind of what's possible.
Exactly. What could be.
What could be.
Yeah.
So we're really. It's really, a painting is kind of a model in a sense of some other dimension or some possibility of how life could be.
I think so. It's both in some ways sort of, static, but also, sort of in flux and not really fixed in a way, just in terms of what it inspires, in terms of how it can communicate, and I guess in some way connecting back to like psychology again too. Oftentimes after people, I think of psychology as a form of applied philosophy in a way, because I remember, growing up, I remember thinking like, oh, I love philosophy, right? And in some philosophy I definitely, find it incredibly interesting. But I remember at a certain point though, with certain philosophers or just certain conversations I've had, just getting so almost like tired and frustrated that you can just like wax philosophic till the cows come home, but like change nothing or do nothing, potentially. Whereas with the psychology, I like it because it's informed, I think, by philosophy and ways of seeing, but with a specific then purpose to try and do something different to bring about some sort of adaptive change to your life.
I guess I would say that I might have had that view, but I started listening to this podcast called Philosophize This quite recently.
I listened to a little of that actually, based on your suggestion, yeah.
It's really good. It's so good. And I've been thinking about it and thinking about, he often talks about these ideas and talks about, not necessarily taking action, but it's like, it seems like, ideas are kind of, there's a lot of power in ideas.
Oh, a huge amount of power of ideas. It's just it's that weird fine line where it's like you have to then act on some of them, right? You have to, in some ways, and even if it's just a mental action, right? Even if it's a different way of seeing things, because that's of course an important part, whether it's psychology, whether it's art, or whether it's just life in general, our perception, right? But there has to be some sort of action, mental action, physical action, whatever the case is, to actually have something change, right? And that's, I guess, that difference between, like we were saying, just like endless possibility versus actual like sort of accomplishment of something, right? Like when I'm a kid, or when I'm thinking, what do I want to do, right? When I grow up, like I can think of I'm going to be a mountain climber, I'm going to be an astronaut, I'm going to be a surgeon, I'm going to be a doctor, whatever the case is. But eventually I have to...
You have to focus on that smaller... I heard this term recently, I can't remember who was saying that intelligence is liquid when you're young and then crystallizes when you get older.
I think to a certain point that is probably true. I think intelligence, again, is like a concept that we've created, right, as humans, So all these things are man-made, and so they're like imperfect. And they change as the sort of culture changes and as the sort of like paradigms shift, right? So, at least in terms of, clinical psychology, they think of when they do like an intelligence test for some sort of neuropsychological assessment, they do look at these different areas of intelligence, and they've sort of, at least for those purposes, mapped the IQ, the intelligence quotient, into, verbal and nonverbal, but then in sort of subdivisions of both the verbal and nonverbal. And they, in those areas, at least consider the verbal areas of intelligence, specifically verbal comprehension, to be very much that sort of crystallized, this is what you learned in school, it's sort of fixed, it's based off of education or exposure to words or concepts, whereas the sort of perceptual reasoning aspect is one of the main nonverbal components. They consider that to be more of the fluid, sort of an ability to think on your feet, to be presented with completely novel stimuli, and to be able to actually work with it and make sense of it, and how those two things sort of like coexist together. And someone could be, of course, very quote-unquote book smart or academically smart, but perhaps not a good, sort of novel thinker, or maybe quote-unquote street smart, as we'll talk about those sort of differences sometimes. Mm-hmm. But I do think, though, that we probably do, just based off the idea of how our brains form and those things like neural pruning, how like we have all these connections. We have too many connections, actually, when we're young. And part of what the brain has to do is strategically cut, sever, prune the connections so that we don't have a connection from our sense of, from our ability to smell to our sense of color, because there's like a synesthesia kind of thing, right? Mm-hmm. Some people continue to maintain that, actually, which is interesting, right? We see that sometimes, but the brain's job is to actually sort of like get rid of the connections that aren't so useful or that don't actually work well in our current environment.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yes. Finally, do you have any advice for anybody that would like to live a more creative and fulfilling life?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, this is very, very general, but I think one thing that's so important and I try to follow is, stay curious. You've got to stay curious about the world. And I think that's such an important thing, to not lose your sense of curiosity. Maybe a sense of wonder. I don't know if that's sort of, too much or too cheesy, but like I think that to maintain a sense of curiosity is so key, both in terms of expanding your knowledge, your perspectives, and just your energy, because I imagine most people have found this, it's so easy to sometimes just like wake up one day and think like, everything's boring, the news is depressing, I'm just gonna go and do the same thing today that I did yesterday, and whether it's you take the subway or take a car or walk or but from a slightly different perspective, like realizing that there's so many interesting things out there, whether it's something random like, hey, they found this strange lantern anglerfish that was swimming towards the surface of the ocean. Normally it's in total like black darkness at the depths of the ocean, or just some new random computer chip was created that states that it's neither liquid nor solid, but somehow in between, not a gas either. Like, oh, that's weird. Or some strange new way of thinking about things, or like literally just again, seeing how your dog responds to something new. The world's a fascinating place, and the fact that we actually exist is kind of insane to begin with. What a strange thing it is to be anything at all, I think they said in Neutral Milk Hotel, Airplane Over the Sea. And it's so true, it's just like, it's crazy. This was never a guarantee, and life was never a guarantee or given for any of us, and to have it is, again, it's a gift, and it's not a gift without a cost, but it's a gift and an opportunity, and so you try to make the most of it, and stay curious, stay interested in things, and then of course too, I'd also try to encourage people to try to be kind, try to be empathic if you can. There's a shortage of that, and a little empathy goes a long way. So,
very nice. Thank you so much for that. And thanks again for chatting today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Be well.
You too.